On North Korea, the breaking news, what's the message here? What's going on?
Well, the North Koreans have essentially played Trump from the start. I think that they recognized that he thought that he was going to be able to deliver a deal which would make him seem like a great peacemaker, maybe win the Nobel Prize. I'm not speculating. Trump has himself said most of this. He got Prime Minister Abe of Japan to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize for the supposed peace that was going to come about. So what the North Koreans realized was they could essentially get Trump to agree to a deal that, where they didn't have to give up their nukes, where they didn't have to give up much of what they were doing. And that was what they were proceeding on. The spanner in the works ended up being Mike Pompeo and John Bolton, Trump's new advisors, who understood what the North Koreans were doing and said, no, if you're not going to actually give up your nukes, there's no deal here. And so the whole thing collapsed, and now the North Koreans are doing precisely what Donald Trump said was the most dangerous thing in the world. Remember, when he came into office, he said, we're this close to war. Right. It was simply because the North Koreans were testing missiles. They are now doing exactly that. They still have the 60 nuclear warheads that we think they might have. They still have the program that we thought they might have. But Donald Trump doesn't talk about it because he thought he was going to be the peacemaker and get a deal.
The love affair.
Right.
He fell in love.
He said, we went in love. Imagine if Barack Obama had said he had fallen in love with Grand Ayatollah Khamenei, in Iran. I mean, the whole thing was Trump. It's negotiating 101. I'm sure he wrote about it in The Art of the Deal. Don't want the deal too badly.
All right, let's talk.
All the fallout of having wanted that deal too badly.
So, okay, and also wanting to work with Russia. I mean, you listen to this phone call, almost an hour-long phone call. The president talks to and then repeats what Putin tells him. Is he naive when it comes to Putin? How would you describe this?
Well, let's take a look at Venezuela, and you tell me what you think. So Putin tells Trump, we have no interest in Venezuela other than to just keep things, just to make sure that there's a positive outcome. Trump's own Secretary of State has said over the last 2 weeks that the Russians are effectively what is propping up the regime, that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Russians who are in Venezuela propping up the regime. He said just a couple of days ago that the reason that the Tuesday uprising, you remember the opposition leader tried to get an uprising in Venezuela, which failed. The reason it failed is that Maduro, the dictator, was about to get on a plane and fly away to Cuba in exile, but the Russians talked him out of it and told him, no, stay there and continue to repress your people. So that's Trump's Secretary of State's version of what the Russian involvement is. And Trump says, no, Putin told me he has no involvement. I mean, yeah, it's the definition of naive.
Okay, but him, in this phone call, not telling Putin to meddle, not telling him not to meddle in the election, is that a dereliction of duty? What is that?
I think, look, about the 2016 election, you can say, look, Trump is sensitive about that. He thinks it affects the sense that people have of his legitimacy. I get it. He's not going to revisit that issue with Putin. But 2020, I think this would be an opportunity for him to demonstrate that he cared about this, that he doesn't want foreigners meddling, that he was willing to draw a line, and most importantly, he doesn't think he needs the Russians to help him win. So this is a win-win-win for Trump to be tough on the Russians, to say, I've talked to Putin about it, I said we absolutely draw a line, and by the way, to direct his own government to thwart these measures. So again, we get back to the kind of central puzzle of the Trump's foreign policy, which is he never wants to confront Putin. And as I've often said, I don't know why that is, but I will point out that, in that same conversation, that same meeting, the chat with the press, he went on about the Europeans as usual. He was, was blasting the Europeans because we have a trade deficit with the Europeans. He never misses a chance to say something nasty about most countries.
Or about our allies.
Right, except the Russians.
Except the Russians. Right. Well, that reminds us of that moment in Helsinki, standing there with Putin.
Right.
Here it is. Let's watch it.
My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
It's It's like he's a spokesperson for the Kremlin, no?
Well, you just think about what Putin must be thinking at that podium to hear the President of the United States saying, my intelligence people tell me this, but Vladimir Putin tells me this. He said it very strongly, so I believe him. I mean, that has got to be the greatest success for a foreign intelligence operation ever, to have the President of the United States believe what Putin said, despite the fact that his own intelligence people, based on multiple sources, evidence, documents, etc., are telling him it's the other way around. That's pretty impressive.
Did you notice that Trump said, Putin, quote, sort of smiled when they talked about election meddling? I mean, on the phone, I don't know, he just sort of smiled. I don't know, maybe, unless they were on video conference, maybe that was it. What do you think of that?
Well, his whole interaction, the way he describes his interactions with Putin, again, is very different from how he describes his interactions with the elected leaders of the West.
Was he making a joke about the Russia investigation? But like,
well, he keeps trying to belittle it. And as I said, let's put that aside in a way, because you're not going to get Donald Trump to say the Russians meddled in 2016, because to him that means his election was illegitimate. But to me, what's most striking is that he's not taking on the opportunity to talk about it, because we know the Russians have ongoing operations. They're trying out things in Ukraine. What they are trying out in Ukraine, they're going to try in the United States. They're trying it in European elections. So this is an active, ongoing issue. We know this only because his own intelligence people testify, his own foreign policy team testifies about this on Capitol Hill.
I got to ask you quickly before you go. You posted this question on your latest op-ed in the Washington Post. You asked, is there a Trump doctrine? What's the answer?
It seems that there is a Trump doctrine, which is a very dark one, which is that the United States gets to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. John Bolton said that the United States has the right to intervene in any country in the Western Hemisphere whenever it wants. And my question is, if that's the case, how do we stop the Russians from intervening in Ukraine? How do we stop the Chinese from intervening in the South China Seas? How do we frankly tell the Iranians not to meddle in Yemen? Yeah. If each one of them invokes the Trump doctrine, then we're in for a very messy, chaotic world.